Hi everyone, welcome to the spring semester. It's nice to be back with you all. This will be the introductory video for Contemporary Art Seminar Dance and Embodied Practices, FA 323 or 523, depending on how you're registered. I'm going to basically use this video to just go over the course syllabus. I'll quickly then touch on the Gay Morris reading that I gave you. And then we'll follow up with videos each week which go more in depth on the different readings that you've been assigned. So if you take a look at the syllabus, everything is pretty much the same as last semester. You can email me for a time for us to have a Skype meeting if you want to have some sort of office hours visit. Everything will be done through the Learning House website, so all of your readings have been posted there. You're not required to buy any books. You'll submit all of your assignments through Learning House. So if you have any trouble accessing that, you should, of course, get in touch as soon as possible. This course, we sort of pick up on what we started last semester with modern and contemporary art history, theory, and method. And we start to focus more on embodied practices, live performance, and also choreography, which is a major component, of course, of the MFA program. I won't go through the course description. I'll allow you to read that. Needless to say, the course is in some ways designed to first give you a bit of a background history on some of the kind of shifts that occurred in dance practice, especially in the US, but also throughout the world. And then we'll spend most of the semester actually trying to look at work. Since what we're talking about is embodied practice and live performance, I think that one of the best ways to access that is actually to spend time watching documents of live performance if you can't actually go see the live thing itself. So the first thing we can look at before we get into how the course is structured each week is to say that the grade is broken down into these three component parts. One is attendance and participation. That's just general, kind of everybody gets that. As long as you participate in the class, you're golden. You don't have to go do anything above and beyond just literally doing the work. Reading response papers, which I'll go over in a minute, and then your final projects. What I've done this semester, since I got some feedback that people wanted a bit more feedback on their writing, is I built smaller writing assignments more frequently throughout the semester. That way I can give you feedback on those writings. And for your final project, as you'll see, you're actually just going to collect all of those short writings as a sort of dossier. So in fact, you'll be writing your final paper as we go along through the course. So that should hopefully make the workload a bit more manageable. So the first thing to note is that you're going to have 4 reading response papers due throughout the entire semester. Each of these reading responses is about 2 pages. It should be a kind of critical or analytic essay. It's not just an opinion piece, and it can't be totally creative insofar as submitting poems or fiction writing, although I encourage you to experiment with form in your writing if you want. You're allowed to pick 4 from any of the dates in which a reading response is due, and there are more dates than you actually need to submit for. So what I recommend you all do is take a look at the syllabus, figure out based on your own schedule and your own interests which dates really work for you, and commit to writing reading responses for those days. I lay out some specifics about what I'm looking for in your reading responses. It's basically the same as last semester. The point is not at all to kind of come down on you heavy about being, critical writers. This is not an undergraduate class. This is an MFA level class. So the idea is really that as artists, you are going to be expected to write about your practice. And you're going to be expected to write about your practice in a variety of ways, whether it's grant applications or proposals, or even just like in communication with curators and arts institutions. So part of what I hope to be able to do in giving you these writing assignments is that we can work on writing together so that you develop tools so that you can frame your practice in the language that it best suits it. In many ways, a lot of practices these days are conditioned by the language that surrounds them. So the stronger you are with language and with writing, the stronger you'll actually be in putting forward what it is that you want to do as an artist. Um, and so I won't go over all the details of what I'm looking for in your papers, including specificity, focus, description, and a kind of argumentation. That's basically to say there should be sort of a thesis and a certain kind of focus in what you're trying to write about. But if you have any questions about those, please do email me. And then, as you'll see, Monday, May 9th, your final project is due. And the final project, as I say, is literally just a kind of compilation of your 4 reading responses, as well as a short introduction to that dossier of writing. So you don't have to go through and connect all of the reading responses together. You might want to go back and revise some of them a little bit based on the feedback that I give you. But in general, you're just going to be collecting that writing as a kind of booklet for me. And for yourselves. I've listed the required course readings. Some of these, if you're very interested in choreography and embodied practices, some of these are actual books that you might want to consider buying for your own library, but I will provide, as I said, PDFs of all of these readings. So let's jump into the schedule of assignments, which is on page 3. As you saw, for this week, we read Gay Morris's Modernist Theory, John Martin, Edwin Denby, John Cage, from her book, A Game for Dancers, Performing Modernism in the Post-War Years. And you also had a video, New York Dance, State of Performance. You'll see there's a lot of video included in the class, and this first week was really just meant to kind of acclimate you to the kind of writing that we'll be looking at and the kind of videos we'll be looking at. So that video, New York Dance, State of Performance, is actually a video that's a documentary. I'm sure most of you watched it by now. That kind of goes through a variety of different series. It's an interesting documentary series where the filmmaker commissions a dance critic from various periods to curate different artists who should be in the film. So this particular film was curated by the dance critic Gia Corliss, who writes for the New York Times and Time Out Magazine in New York, as well as other venues. But there are also previous States of Dance performances, so if you like the documentary, you might try looking those up. So that's really just to get us acclimated to the kind of the trajectory of the course. I'll go over Gay Morris in a minute, but just moving on. Next week, we're reading the first part of Ramsey Burt's book, Judson Dance Theater, Performative Traces, and it's a lot of reading. I just gave you the entire first half of the book, 1 through 116. So my hope is that, first of all, Burt's writing is very accessible. It really is kind of anecdotes and short. It's broken down into these short pieces about different dancers and choreographers. And it does a really good job of exploring choreographic practice in relationship to the visual arts of its time, as well as a larger historical context. So you'll see that Burt actually talks about someone like the choreographer Simone Forti and the sculptor Robert Morris, and talks about what was going on in the early 60s around them as they were developing their work. So I think it's just a really good primer for us, and I fully expect that you'll skim some of the pages. Some of it will be uninteresting to you, some of it will be familiar to you, but you should just kind of use the Burt book as a background for the future work that we do in the class. And you'll see that a number of the choreographers whose work we look at throughout the course are actually given their own little section inside of Burt's book. So it's almost like a textbook, really. So you're going to read the first half of Burt's text, and then the following week, for the following week of February 8th, you'll actually watch Merce Cunningham's Points in Space, which was filmed in 1986. It was choreographed much earlier than that. It was filmed, I believe, by the BBC as a documentary. And so a couple things to point out here. One is that all of these videos that are in the syllabus can be accessed through the Learning House website. And there's actually a file at the very top of our course that says something like video files. I don't actually have it in front of me right now, but it should be self-explanatory. In there are all the videos that you'll need for the course. You can download them so you can watch them on your own time when you're not connected to the network. It might take a little while to download them, so I would make sure that you have a chance to download them, not right when you're running out the door. And I just ask that because most of this is copyrighted material that we're allowed to look at in an educational setting, that you not distribute it. So please don't post any of this online, even fragments or sections of it. Actually, a lot of these videos came to me because I asked choreographers that I know to give me the video to share with you. So it's also a trust system where it would be respectful to me if you just don't post anything. So the way that I've broken the syllabus down is that we're going to alternate between reading weeks, watching weeks, reading weeks, watching weeks. And it's because, like I said, in order to really explore live performance, especially in the context of an MFA program, and the strange way we're doing it because we're an online class, it's so useful for us to actually be looking at work together. It should be way more interesting than just reading about these practices. You know, when you read about dance, you're already reading a translation of the thing itself. It's not like when you read about a painting and they can reproduce an image of the painting in the book, right? You can maybe get photographs from the dance, but to see the live event, it's a much more complicated question, and one that we'll keep asking throughout the course of, like, how do we actually gain access to performance? So hopefully that'll be interesting for you, and I've paired the readings so that they reflect upon the videos that follow them. So you'll read about Merce Cunningham in Ramsey Burt's book, and then you'll get to watch Merce Cunningham yourself. I will go over in more depth, of course, like what the videos are about and why I assign them during my weekly lectures. But for now, we're just going to leave it at that. So you'll watch Merce Cunningham, you'll read more Ramsey Burt, you'll watch some Trisha Brown. Then we'll read about Yvonne Rainer's practice from Carrie Lambert Beatty and a wonderful theorist, So-Young Yoon. Then we'll watch Yvonne Rainer. Then you'll have Spring Break. Following that, we'll start to explore beyond just the canon of American performance. You'll look at Daniel Goldman and Andre Lepecki, who are writing about questions of control and improvisation. And you'll look at the work of Echo Nkoma and Meg Stewart. You'll read more Daniel Goldman and Brenda Dixon Gottschalk. We'll look at the kind of relation of race and global ideas of race and choreography. Then you'll read from David Gear's book, and we'll look at questions of disability and AIDS and virus and the kind of intimacy of bodies in relationship to choreography. And then we'll conclude actually by reading an excerpt from a very recent book by Jen Joy and watching the work of a very kind of emerging choreographer, Jen Rosenblit, which touches on some kind of queer theory issues which have been very relevant to the field of dance studies. So that's the course. It really alternates between those weeks. Hopefully, it feels a bit more light than the kind of heavy modernism that we covered last semester. And I think it should be actually a fun course. Throughout the whole semester, what we'll be constantly asking ourselves is, how do we evaluate, how do we engage with the kind of intelligence and the knowledge that is being put forth through a work of art, and especially through performed works of art, right? So rather than privileging the text, these texts that are often by scholars about dance performers and saying, this is how we gain knowledge, I'm giving you videos as a chance to really look at them and say, how do we actually access this material? How does it become useful for us? What is it trying to say? And also as a way to kind of augment maybe your own practices. If you're interested in performance, this is the best way to start kind of exploring performance and expanding performance is, of course, to go see work and see what people are doing. So that's my introduction. Again, feel free to email me if you have any questions. I'll now give you a really brief synopsis of the Gay Morris reading that we did. So Gay Morris writes this book, and it's really, I'm giving it to you really as a precursor to the kinds of questions that'll be asked in the artists that we're looking at. Morris is writing particularly about dance and modernism. We're looking at contemporary arts practice. That's kind of code word for postmodern, although that word itself will become sort of problematized in our later readings. So this is kind of where all of the kind of contemporary choreography sort of emerges from, this moment that Morris is writing about. And she gives us two seminal dance writers, John Martin and Edwin Denby, both dance critics in their own right. And she also gives us John Cage discussing the kind of aesthetic value of dance. John Cage being the experimental composer who we discussed last semester, a real seminal figure at Black Mountain College, and collaborator with Merce Cunningham, a lifelong collaborator with Merce Cunningham. So in Morris's reading, we get that there is a concern that should feel familiar from last semester, and it's a concern again for the degree to which dance or performance or a live art or the kind of encounter with art engages the audience, to what degree it engages the audience, and what degree it is meant as a kind of social force. Is dance meant to bring people together and kind of convey a message? Or the degree to which dance is about formalism and abstraction? Is it about distancing us from a familiar world? So should dance be telling a story that we recognize, or should the movements be so abstract that we don't recognize structure inside of it, or at least narrative structure? And always at the center of that concern is a concern over how we should understand viewing live bodies in space. And this is going to be a problem that we'll keep coming up against, and it's so fruitful and so interesting that it's so ingrained in the language around art that art objects are timeless, that they exist and they persist, right? That a painting like the Mona Lisa hangs at the Louvre, and it hangs there and it remains unchanged in some ways, right? It has a different temporality than all the people who are going to see it, who are aging and dying and generation upon generation going to see Mona Lisa exactly as she is. Not so with live performance, of course, and not so in the most acute way where you go see a dance, it happens, it's over, you leave, and it's done. You can record it, but then the recording, one might say, is something entirely different than being at the live event. You could go back the next night, but you're not there the previous night, and the dance might be slightly different, even if they're doing the same moves. So that kind of ephemerality, it's called that ephemerality or of performance, is really challenging for the ingrained ways that we think about art as very much kind of a static object in time. So really for inside of, that's the kind of larger perspective of how dance fits in the visual arts field. Now inside of dance itself as a medium, we're going to be confronted with these questions of what should be the focus of dance. Is it about the mechanics of the movement? Or is it about the communication capacity that live performance has? So really another way to say that is, should dance have a narrative or not? Or does it activate some other aesthetic sense or other set of values beyond narrative? Is dance a visual medium? Is it something that we as the audience sit and watch? Or is it a somatic medium? Is it the kind of medium that actually touches you in a certain way, that seeing live bodies move, bodies that are moving in relationship to their own sense of their capacity and movement, how does that relate to the audience? Is it a different type of connection than the one of standing in front of a painting and looking at it? So this question between somatic and sorry, I'm looking at my notes. The somatic and the visual will become really interesting for us to explore. So you can see in Morris's summary of these thinkers the kinds of foundations of modernism that we already rehearsed last semester and we're not going to go over again. It's something that a number of the artists in this class will be reacting against, and that's just why it's good to refamiliarize ourselves with it. Modernism, it means one thing in the visual arts, and it means something similar but slightly different in the kind of confines of the dance world or in terms of the history of choreography. So really what postmodern and contemporary choreographers will be reacting against kind of most strongly, and this is a very broad generalization, but one is ballet. Ballet is the most familiar form of dance. It's all about this verticality, this being upright. It comes out of a court dance in Louis' court in France in the Renaissance. And so there's this whole sense of the kind of highbrow nature of ballet and its attachment to telling a narrative that a lot of dancers and a lot of choreographers will react against. At the same time, a lot of postmodern and contemporary choreographers will draw on the techniques of ballet to do something different with it. In addition to that, the modern dance movement is perhaps best summarized by the choreographer Martha Graham. And if you don't know Martha Graham, it's really easy to look it up, but a quick summary is that Graham reperformed a number of the Greek tragedies. She believed that she became these heroic female figures. For Graham, the movement was all about a contraction that happened in the core of the body. This contraction, of course, it goes against the kind of verticality and the relationship to the limbs that ballet has. And Graham's work might be said to be highly expressive because each gesture was supposed to have so much significance. This as well, postmodern and contemporary dancers will react against, because they will react against the idea that they are becoming something else in the context of making their work. There will be a reaction against the kind of extreme expressiveness that Graham puts forward, and again, the attachment to telling a story, to dance having a narrative inside of it. So Morris concludes by saying that in spite of their differences, all three of the critics and the writers that she's summarizing, Cage, Martin, and Denby, shared a modernist project grounded in trying to define dance as a pure or autonomous art form. And perhaps most central, Morris claims, was their investment in separating out the mind-body connection, right? So we have this notion of the mind-body split, right? The mind controls the body. The mind is somehow superior to the body. That the body, if you err, if you slip, if you fall, it's because your body fails you, not your mind, right? This sort of privileging of the mind over the body, it goes way, way back in theory and history, and we won't need to rehearse all of that. But it's important for Morris that these writers, Cage, Martin, and Denby, they in a way say that the best way to access dance, to appreciate its value, to get inside of it, is you have to let go of the mind and just approach with the body. So you have to let go of intellect. You have to let go of the intellectual. Now, this is an interesting proposition because on the one hand, it undermines the way in which we privilege thinking over other ways of inhabiting space. And at the same time, it's super problematic to assume that the body itself doesn't have a kind of knowledge that is in relationship to the mind. So a lot of the readers that we'll read and a lot of the choreographers we'll look at, in many ways play with that dynamic between mind and body and how it's a much more supple relationship than saying simply the mind controls the body. So, and on top of that, to say that the mind and the body are split and that the body is what you have to approach dance with and that the dance in some ways doesn't have a mind is to reproduce a kind of violence that assumes that dancers are kind of thoughtless, that they're just creatures of habit, that they just take in the choreography that's given to them and do it exactly as such. I think it's much more interesting to kind of consider the dynamic in which a choreographer develops work and passes it on to another body. And then that body performs work. And what is that exchange that's going on? There's a lot that happens in there that we can explore. But I want us to hold on to this idea that Morris leaves us with, that dance and embodied practices really reconfigure what it means to know or see or understand a work of art. And in many ways, this course is about looking at dance together, and it's going to be about trying to discover language to describe what it is that we're seeing, which is, I think, a much more challenging and enriching task than we might at first think it is. So that's where I'll leave you for the first lecture. I'll pick up with an introduction to Ramsey Burt in the next video. Welcome back, and it's good to be here.